Hi everyone, this is Rosie, and today we're going to be sewing an all-purpose caddy with 3 interior divided sections. So let's get started. Let's take a look at the caddy. It's approximately 12 inches wide by 6 3/4 inches high by 6 inches deep, and I've installed a leather handle on each side of the caddy. There are numerous pockets on the exterior for holding your tools. And then you have the same number of pockets on the opposite side. There are even some pockets here on the side where you can store more narrow objects. The interior has 3 equally divided sections that are 6 inches by 4 inches. And here I have some socks that need to be finished by closing up the toes. I can put all of those in one section. Then I have quite a few of my knitting tools and needles in that jar there. And some of my circular knitting needles. And in the last section, I can even put some yarn for future socks. It really is an all-purpose caddy though. You can use this for just about anything, and I'm sure that all of you will come up with many, many uses. I first want to very quickly go over the materials that I'll be using in the project. Now, I don't want to be taking the time to be giving you the measurements, but I do have a cutting chart available that you can download, and you will find the link to that chart in the description below the video. That chart will give you all the information that you need for the pieces that you need to cut and the sizes that they need to be cut at. Right here on top, I have 2 pieces of Decovil light that will be used to stabilize the body of the bag. Then I have 2 pieces of Pellon Peltex. This is the non-fusible type, and this will be used to stabilize the divider sections on the interior of the bag. I have 2 leather strips that I will be using for my side handles. If you don't want to use leather, you certainly can make your handles out of fabric or some other material. And then to secure those handles in place, I have 4 sets of rivets. And this strip right here will be used for binding the top of the bag. Now, all of the fabrics that I have here are 100% cotton quilting fabrics. The binding strips do not need to be interfaced with anything. Next up, I have 2 pieces that will serve as the exterior pockets. These pieces have been interfaced with Pellon SF101, and I do like to pre-fuse my fabrics before I cut them out. Then I have these 2 pieces here, which will be used for the exterior pocket linings, and both of these pieces have been interfaced with the Pellon SF101. These 2 pieces here will be used for the exterior body of the bag, and once again they have been interfaced with the Pellon SF101. Last up, I have the 3 pieces that will be used to create the interior divided sections. Each one of these pieces has been interfaced with Pellon SF101. The longest piece here is lining piece 2 on your cutting chart. Then I have 2 pieces here, and that will be lining piece 3 on your cutting chart. And then the larger 2 pieces here are lining piece 1 on your cutting chart. So now let's go ahead and start sewing the project. In this step, we will be sewing the exterior pocket lining to the exterior pockets. The first thing that I like to do is mark my seam line. The seam allowances for the entire project will be 1/2 of an inch. So from the top of the pocket, I have marked a straight line 1/2 inch down from the top. Then we're just going to place the exterior pocket with the lining right sides together and clip it all the way along the length. Make sure that all of your edges are nice and even along the top and the sides. After clipping the 2 sections together, we're going to sew straight across the seam. I'm ready to sew my exterior pocket to the lining. I will be sewing on a Texo 4800 Pro, and I'm using a stitch length of 4.0. If I was sewing on a domestic, I would be using a stitch length of 3.0. I have a size 20 needle in my machine, and I'm using a Tex 70 polyester thread. The seam allowance is 1/2 of an inch, and you do want to backstitch at both ends. After sewing your seam, you want to place the piece so that the exterior side is on your work surface with the lining side facing up. Then you're going to take the lining and push it up and away from the exterior pocket, and you want to press that very nicely. Then you're going to turn the piece over, and you want to fold your lining back down so that the lining and the exterior pockets are wrong sides together. Just like this, and then you're going to give it a nice pressing. Now, you'll probably have a little strip here on the bottom, and that's okay. I gave you a little extra wiggle room for sewing your pieces together. So you're going to go ahead and cut that little strip here off of the lining to be even with the exterior pocket. After you trim off that little strip of lining, we want to go back to the top and stitch the lining to the exterior pocket by stitching in the ditch all the way across the top of the pocket. The ditch is going to be where the seam is that joined your lining and your exterior. And if you want, you can go ahead and hold that in place with a few clips as you sew it. I'm ready to stitch in the ditch across the top of the pocket, and I will be using a stitch length of 5.0. If I were sewing on a domestic, I would be using a stitch length of 3.0, and you do want to backstitch at both ends. And you just want to go slow to make sure that you stay in that ditch. Now you can go ahead and prepare your second exterior pocket piece in exactly the same way. In this step, we're going to be sewing the exterior pockets to the exterior body of the bag. The first thing that I like to do is take my exterior body, and I want to mark my 1/2 inch seam allowances from both sides and from the bottom. You don't need to mark the seam allowance on the top. The next thing I do is take my pocket section that I've already created, and I want to lift the exterior up and away from the lining. And I'm going to mark a line 3.5 inches up from the bottom of the lining. So I'll just place my ruler here and mark 3.5 inches. Now I want to bring back my exterior body, and I'm going to place the pocket section on top. I want to make sure that my bottom edges and my side edges are all even, and in addition to that I want to make sure that I have an equal distance from the top of the binding to the top of the bag. So I'm quickly going to go ahead and measure the distance, and it's about 1.5, the top of the binding is about 1.5 inches down from the top of the bag body. Then I'm going to go ahead and put a few clips in the side here, but I do not want to clip past that 3.5 inch line. So we're just clipping the top. And then I'm going to lift this up, and I want to clip the lining for the pocket to the body of the bag. You don't need a lot of clips, we just want to hold it in place as we sew. Now we want to sew straight across on the line that we drew 3.5 inches up from the bottom. What this is going to do, it's going to set the depth of our pockets. So when you put something in, it will not fall below this line, because the section below the line is actually going to be the bottom of the bag. So it's essentially preventing whatever you put into your pockets from falling down to the bottom of the bag. I'm ready to sew on the line that we marked 3.5 inches up from the bottom, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic I would be using a stitch length of 3.0, and I will back stitch at both ends. Now I need to mark some lines for the division of my pockets. You can divide this up however you like. I like to have 3 pockets with a 6-inch wide pocket right in the center of the bag. So the first thing that I do is make a couple of marks right down the center of the panel. Now you will see me using a friction pen in the video. You want to be very careful where you use these. I only use them in my videos for demonstration purposes, because while the marks will disappear with heat, they can come back with cold. Now that I have the center points marked, I'm going to take my 6-inch wide ruler and I'm going to place the 3-inch line on those center marks. And I'll be drawing a line from the top of the pocket down towards the bottom on each side of my ruler. But we don't want the lines to extend all the way to the bottom. They need to stop 3.5 inches from the bottom. So I'm going to make a mark here. That's 3.5 inches up from the bottom, and another mark over here, which is 3.5 inches from the bottom. And I'll start making my line, drawing my line from that 3.5 inch mark up to the top of the pocket. So these 2 lines here will be my stitching lines I'll start by stitching right at the top of the pocket, and I will end right here. I'm ready to stitch on the lines that we drew. I'm using a stitch length of 5.0. On a domestic, I would be using a stitch length of 3.0, and you want to make sure that you backstitch really well, especially at the top of your pockets. And I'll stop where that line ends. And now you can go ahead and stitch down the other line in exactly the same way. The last thing that we need to do for our exterior panel is to cut out the square corners so that we can box up the bottom of the bag. So we're going to turn it so that the wrong side is facing up. You can see the two lines that we stitch right here for the division of the pockets. Then we have this line that we sewed straight across, which is 3.5 inches up from the bottom. Nothing will be able to fall below that line when you place something in your pockets. So now you want to take your ruler and mark a 3-inch square box on each side of the bag. And then you're going to take your scissors and just cut right on the lines that you just drew. You'll do this on both sides. And now we just want to baste our sections together. So you'll start here at the top of the pocket, down the side, around the boxed corner, across the bottom, around the other boxed corner, and up the other side. I'm going to start my basting with a stitch length of 5.0, and I will backstitch at both ends. You want to make sure that you stay within that 1/2 inch seam allowance. I went ahead and prepared my second exterior panel in exactly the same way. Now I want to interface the back of each one of these sections with the Decovil light. So you're going to take your Decovil and you want to cut out the same 3-inch squares on each corner just as you did for the exterior. So I've already marked mine, and now I'm going to cut them out. After you have the corners cut out of the Decovil, you're going to adhere the Decovil to the wrong side of one of your exterior pieces. You want the top edge of your Decovil to be 1/2 inch down from the top edge of the bag and 1/2 inch in from each side, and that will keep a lot of bulk out of your seam line. So go ahead and line it up and then adhere this according to the manufacturer's instructions. Now you're going to notice that mine seems short, and the reason why is simply because I was running out of Decovil, so the piece that I cut for my interfacing is not as high as the piece that you will be cutting for yours. In this step, we'll be sewing the exterior bag together. So you want to take your two exterior panels and place them right sides together. And we're going to start by sewing the bottom seam. So you want to make sure that all of your edges are nice and even, and you're going to clip them together. After clipping them together, you're going to sew right along your 1/2 inch seam line. I'm using a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic, I would be using a stitch length of 3.0, and the seam allowance is 1/2 of an inch, and I'm going to backstitch at both ends. Press that seam open, and then from the right side, we're going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the edge on each side of that seam. I'm top stitching 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the seam with a stitch length on a 5.0. On a domestic, I'd probably be top stitching with a stitch length of about 4.0. And you want to back stitch at both ends. And then you can go ahead and top stitch the other side of the seam in exactly the same way. Now we can sew the bag sides together, so you want to line up your two exterior panels, right sides together, and we're going to clip our side seams. Now what I like to do is make sure that the top of the pocket on both sides are even with each other. So I line those up first, and then when they look like they're even to me, I'll put a clip on each side of that pocket. And then we'll clip down the side, and then we can go ahead and sew these seams together with a 1/2 inch seam. You'll go ahead and clip the other side together in exactly the same way. I'm sewing the side seams together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic, I would use a stitch length of 3.0, and again, you do want to back stitch. Then you can go ahead and sew your other side seam in exactly the same way. Go ahead and press both side seams open, and then we're going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from each side of that seam, just like we did for the bottom of the bag. To top stitch those side seams, you want to first make sure that that seam is laying flat against the bed of your machine. Then you're going to start to place it underneath that presser foot, and you're going to wiggle it until the bottom of the bag is positioned underneath that presser foot. Then you can go ahead and lower it, and I'm going to be stitching with a stitch length of 5.0, just like we did for the bottom. And you do want to back stitch. When I get to where the pocket is, I do like to back stitch over that area. And then you can go ahead and sew the other side of the seam exactly the same way. All of the top stitching on my seams is done. Now, if you don't want to do the top stitching on the seams, you really don't have to, but it does help your seams to lay nice and flat. So now that we're done with that, we can go ahead and box up our corners. So you're just going to pull everything aside just like this, and you want to match up your center seams. Just go ahead and clip everything together, and then we're going to sew straight across with a 1/2 inch seam. Then you'll clip the other corner side of the bag in exactly the same way. I'm sewing the boxed corners with a stitch length of 4.0 and a seam allowance of 1/2 of an inch, and on a domestic I would use a seam allowance of 3.0. You want to make sure that you back stitch well at each end. Now for my boxed corners, I do like to also stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'll just line everything up and go ahead and sew that second seam. Then you can go ahead and sew your other boxed corner in exactly the same way. After sewing the boxed corners, I do like to trim them down to about 1/4 of an inch. So do that on both sides. Then I'm going to turn the bag right side out, and after I turn it right side out, I do like to give it a really good pressing. In this step, we're ready to attach our handles. The first thing that I did was give my bag a nice pressing, and all I basically did was iron some nice creases in the 4 sides of the bottom, and then I ironed some creases in the 4 sides of the bag. Then I took my handles and I mitered the corners, and I just eyeballed that. Then I measured 1/2 inch up from the bottom and 3/8 inches in from each side, and I placed a mark. Then I took my hole punch and I punched out the holes where I made the mark. And I did that to both handles on each side. The next thing that I did was make some marks for where I need to punch holes into the sides of the bag, because that's where I'm putting my handles. And all I basically did was take the handle and I butted the edge of the handle up to the bottom of the binding here. And I placed the side edge of the handle about 1/2 of an inch in from the side, and then I took my pen and made a mark there. And then I did the same exact thing on the other side. I just placed it, the end of the strap, about 1/2 inch in from the edge of the bag, and placed a mark. And again, I only eyeballed that. And I did that on both sides of the bag. And now that I have those markings, I can go ahead and take my hole punch and punch out those 4 holes. So I have my hole punch here, and I'm just going to slip it onto the side of the bag and line the punch up with the hole and punch out my hole. And I'll do this to all 4 holes. And now that I finished punching out the holes on the sides of the bag, I'm just going to take the rivets, place them through the holes on the handle, and then through the holes on the bag here. And then I'll set it in place with a end cap, just like this. And after I have the rivets set on all 4 holes, I'll go over to my rivet press and press the rivets in place. And I will do that off camera. In this step, we're going to be sewing our divided lining. So you want to take this piece here, which is marked lining 1 on your cutting chart, and you want to have it oriented so that the 15.75 inch side is going in this direction. Then we're going to cut a rectangle out of each lower side of that piece. And the rectangle needs to be 4 inches wide by 9 inches high. So I'm just going to mark that with my pen. And then I can flip it over and mark the same size rectangle on this side. So 4 inches wide by 9 inches high. Now if you prefer to do a cloth handle, you can actually use these scrap pieces here to create handles for each side of the bag. After cutting out those rectangles, we want to mark 1/2 inch seam allowances along all the edges except for the top edge. And I have one here that I've already marked so that you can see what it looks like. So I've marked everything except for this top edge here. Now take your 2 smaller pieces, which are marked lining piece 3 on your cutting charts, and on the wrong side you want to mark 1/2 inch sewing lines on all 4 sides on each piece. Take your lining piece 1 and your lining piece 3. You want to place them right sides together up along this edge here. We'll clip it in place, make sure that all of your edges are even, and then we're going to sew straight across here with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm sewing with a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic, I would use a stitch length of 3.0, and you do want to backstitch at each end. Press that seam open, and then you're going to fold lining piece 3 onto lining piece 1 so that they're wrong sides together, and press. And do not top stitch along this seam line. And then I like to baste these two edges together. You want to do that about 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I am going to do the basting off camera, and I'll use a stitch length of 4.0 on a domestic 3.0. Place your piece on your work surface with the right side facing up. Then you want to take this end here and fold it up towards the top. Now you have this bottom edge right here and this bottom edge here. You want those edges to be in line with each other. And then you want to take your side edges, so this side edge here and this side edge here, and you want to bring those together while at the same time keeping those bottom edges lined up with each other. So line everything up and then clip in place. Then you'll do the same thing on this side. Keep these bottom edges in line with each other and then bring the sides together while at the same time keeping those bottom edges lined up, and then clip in place. After both sides are clipped into place, we're going to sew this side seam right here. You want your needle to drop down right into this intersecting point. This is going to be the bottom of the seam. You do not want your stitching to go beyond this intersecting point. I'm ready to sew that seam with a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic, I would be sewing with a stitch length of 3.0. And I want you to see that I've dropped my needle right in the point where those two lines, those two seam lines, intersect with each other. And you do want to backstitch at both ends, but you want to try and be careful not to go past this seam line right here when you're backstitching. Now you don't need to sew all the way to the top here. You just need to sew to where this piece right here ends. And then do backstitch. Now I'm sewing the seam on the other side, and this time I'm starting at the top of the seam and I'll sew down to that intersection. And I'm coming up onto that intersection right here. I want that needle to stop right in that point where those two lines intersect. After you sew that seam, you want to flip this over. And we had basted lining piece 3 to lining piece 1. I removed a few of my basting stitches so that that line of basting stops right above my stitching line. Now that I've done that, you want to take this edge right here and fold it up. Just like this. and then flip it over. And you're going to take this edge here and fold it up. So it should look just like this. I'm going to hold those two edges together with a clip. Now from this side, you have this piece exposed right here. I'm going to take my scissors and I want to make a little clip, and I'm only making the clip in this edge right up to that seam line. And actually you want to stop just slightly before that seam line. Just like that. After you make the clip, you can take this out and pull this corner out this way. Line up those edges and put a few clips to hold it in place. Just like this. And then we're going to sew that seam together. And when we sew, we want our line of stitching to stop right where this intersection is. So your needle will stop right there. Once again, I'm sewing with a stitch length of 4.0. I've dropped my needle into the work right where those two lines intersect, and I am going to back stitch. Again, you want to be careful not to go past this line of stitching here when you do your back stitching. And now I'm going to sew the other side exactly the same way, and this time I'll stop right here where those two lines intersect. When you're finished sewing that seam, this is what it should look like from this side. You can see the two lines of stitching intersecting right here. And this is what it looks like on the opposite side. Here's the unit all completed. And you need to go ahead and complete the second one in exactly the same way. And these are the units that will be sitting on the ends of the caddy. Now we can sew lining piece 2 to both ends of the units that we just created, and this is going to create that center divided section on the interior. You want to turn it so that it's wrong side facing up and mark in all of your 1/2 inch seam lines. Next, you want to mark the center along the length. Then take one of the units that you just finished creating. The piece that's right here is lining piece 3. So here's lining piece 3. You want to turn it over, and right here you're going to find the bottom edge of lining piece 3. You want to mark the center of that bottom edge, which should be 3.5 inches in from each side edge. Then take your lining piece 2, and we're going to match the center point up of lining piece 3 with the center point of lining piece 2 and clip them together. I'm just going to turn it around this way and go ahead and clip along that length. Now we're going to sew those two pieces together, and once again we're going to be sewing from the intersecting point right here over to the other side, and we will stop at the intersecting point on this side. You don't want to sew beyond those points. I dropped my needle down into the piece where those two lines intersect, and I'm going to sew with a stitch length of 4.0 or 3.0 on a domestic. You do want to back stitch at both ends. And when you get to the other side here, you're going to be stopping right at this point where those two lines intersect. And backstitch. This is the seam that we just sewed. I'm going to put a little mark at the end of the seam on each side. Then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to make a little clip just shy of that seam line right here. You can fold this seam right here out of the way if you like, and then go ahead and make a small clip. And then you'll do the same thing on the other side. I'll just push this seam out of the way and clip just shy of that seam line. I'm only clipping through this piece right here, which is lining piece 2. After you make those clips, you can take lining piece 2 and clip it to the seam of the end unit, just like this. And then we'll clip the other side in exactly the same way. After you have your sides clipped together, you're going to notice that lining piece 2 extends slightly above the top of the end unit pieces, and that's fine. The reason why I did it that way is to leave you a little bit of extra wiggle room. Now, on this side of the seam, we have some stitching, and on this side of the seam, there is no stitching. So when I stitch up this side, I actually like to stitch from the side that already has the stitching, because I want to follow that same stitch line. The only difference will be now we're going to extend that stitch line all the way to the top of the seam here. I'm going to be stitching these side seams now, and I'm using a stitch length of 4.0 or 3.0 on a domestic. You do want to backstitch. And now I'm just going to follow that previous line of stitching. And I'm going to stop right where these two lines of stitching intersect. Now we'll go ahead and sew the other side in exactly the same way, and I'm going to drop my needle right where those two lines of stitching intersect. Now I'm going to take the second end unit and I'm going to match the center point of lining piece 3 here with the center point of lining piece 2 in exactly the same way as we did before. So go ahead and line up those marks and clip the two sections together. And then we're going to sew the seam in the same exact way as we did before. We'll start at the intersecting points on this end and we'll sew across to the intersecting points on that end. You want to backstitch at both ends, and I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera. You're doing this exactly the same way as you did before. I just finished sewing that seam, and again I'm just making little marks at the end of the seam line because we're going to clip into that seam allowance. And again, we're only clipping through lining piece 2. And I'll stop just short of the stitching on both sides. After making those clips, I can go ahead and clip the side of piece 2 to the side of the end unit. And again, you'll clip both sides together, and we're going to stitch this exactly the way we did before. I will stitch from this side over my previous line of stitching, and you do not want to stitch past that intersecting point there. And again, I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera because you're doing this in exactly the same way as we did for the first end unit. So here's the interior with the 3 divided sections. The next thing that I like to do is go ahead and trim down a few of these seams. So I'm going to trim this one right here. And I'm just trimming it about halfway to 1/4 of an inch. And then I'll trim this one here, also to about 1/4 of an inch. And then I'll trim the side seams. After trimming, I just go ahead and give everything a really nice pressing. And after pressing it, we're going to take our Peltex pieces and insert them in the middle sections. So I have the Peltex pieces here, and you're going to find that you have this little pocket here, and that is where you're going to insert your Peltex. And you just want to wiggle it down in there until it gets all the way up to the top. You want it to be all the way up where this top seam is. Now before I do that, I actually do go and press it first. But after pressing, that will be your next step. Also, before I do my pressing, I go ahead and trim the top ends of that lining piece 2 to be even with the end units. So I just line the ruler up and trim. And you want to do this on both sides. I finished ironing the interior divided sections, and I did this basically the same way I did for the exterior. I ironed some nice creases into the sides and also into the bottom. And now we can take this and go ahead and set it down into the exterior. So I'll bring that back, just insert it in here and push it down. And then you want to go ahead and clip the exterior to the interior all the way around. I did go ahead and mark the center of my interior, and all I did to mark my centers was I matched up the side seams here and pulled this out straight, and then I made my mark. So when I clip this in place, I like to first line up the center mark of the end of the interior with the seam on the side. And I'll just put in a couple of clips. Then I'll do the same exact thing on the other side, and then I'll continue to clip all the way around. After clipping the top edges all the way around, I like to go ahead and baste both the exterior and interior sections together all the way around the top. I'm basting the interior and exterior sections together with a stitch length of 5.0, and you want to stay about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. Try and keep all of those edges nice and even. The last thing that we need to do is to prepare our binding to sew around the rim of the caddy. So you'll take the strip that you've cut out for your binding, and you want to fold it so that the wrong sides are together. You're going to bring those two long raw edges together and press all along the length, which I've already done here. After you press it, you're going to bring the two short ends together, right sides together, and you're going to sew those two short ends together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera. After sewing the seam, you can just finger press it open and then bring the two raw edges together again and refold the binding. Now, right where the seam is, you want to fold it right there, and then stretch it out to the opposite end, just like this, and place a mark right up here on the raw edge side of the binding. So these will be our side center seam marks. This is where we're going to place the binding onto the caddy. I've drawn in my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that is optional. You don't have to if you don't want to. So now we're ready to clip it to the top of the bag. I'm going to start with my seam right here, and I'm going to clip that to the side seam of the caddy. And then I'm going to go to the other side, and where I have this center mark here, that's going to get clipped to the seam on the opposite side. And then you're going to go ahead and clip the binding to the caddy all the way around. I have the binding clipped into place, and now I'm ready to go ahead and sew it. I'm ready to sew on the binding with a stitch length of 4.0. On a domestic, you would be using a stitch length of 3.0. You don't need to backstitch right now. We can take care of that at the end. try and keep all of your edges nice and even. Right now I have my drop down guide in place, and I may actually stop using it if I find it's not really helping me too much. And now when you get back to your starting point, you can just stitch over those original stitches a few times and then backstitch. After your binding is all sewn into place, you're going to lift it up away from the bag. Just like this, all the way around the top. Then you're going to take this folded edge, you want to take your binding and fold it in towards the interior of the bag, and that folded edge right there should be covering your line of stitching. If you need to trim back this seam allowance here a little bit so that the fold is covering your stitching line, that's fine too. But you just want to go ahead and clip this all the way around. I have my binding all clipped into place. And you have two options for sewing down your binding. You can either sew it down by hand, which is what I'm going to do, or you can machine stitch it. Well, here's the caddy all completed with the binding stitched into place. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and that you found it useful, and I would love to see the ones that you make. I would like to sincerely thank everybody who has supported me by liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. I also have a Facebook group called Rosie and David Patterns, and I would love to see you over there. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.